Good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon for some of you, and thank you for connecting to this session in what I believe is now the fourth week of the course on the labor dimensions of climate change and human mobility. So thank you very much for joining. As you may already have noticed, and as you may know, in this fourth week, we are looking at Module 3 of our handbook, which focuses on the international governance framework for the nexus between climate change and human mobility. So I'm very happy to be hosting this session today that looks specifically at the governance dimension, and I'm happy to be joined by three colleagues from three different organizations, so they can also help us bring in this interagency dimension and of the cooperation between different agencies under the larger umbrella of the international governance of climate mobility. Before I introduce the speakers of this panel to you, let me maybe take a couple of minutes for a few quick housekeeping announcements as usual. The session is being recorded. The recording will be put on the eCampus as soon as possible, right after the end of the session, as you are already used to. We understand that there have been some issues in accessing the PDF files of the individual modules. I understand that this is a recurring issue that we are trying to fix very hard, but please rest assured that we have not. It's not out of our mind. We are working on it, and you will be able to access the module as of the end of the day today. Another thing that by now you will surely be used to is that we try to keep the sessions as informal and as engaging as possible. So if at any point during the discussion today you have any questions, if at any point you would like to share your comments, your reflections, interact directly with the speakers that are joining us today, please feel free to do that. We are very much encouraging these exchanges between the participants, the training team, let's say, and the guest speakers that we have as part of our sessions. And this is very much the added value of participating in a live session, is that you get to interact with the people that we bring on board. So please do not hesitate to either raise your hand using the reaction function at the bottom of your screen to take the floor directly, or if you have any reflections, any questions, any experiences that you would like to share, you may also type it in the chat and we can pick it up from there. So the session today, as I mentioned, is going to take the format of a panel discussion between our three guests, and I would like to take a few minutes now to introduce them to you before we go into the very heart of the session, let's say. So our first speaker is Paul Tacon, whom you've already met at the beginning of the course, so he will need no introduction, but just to let's say recap a little bit, Paul is our focal point for climate and mobility within the migrant department at the International Labor Organization, and he is based in Geneva. Paul is just back, as are the other speakers as well, just back from the COP29. So he may also have some, all of the speakers today may also have some interesting insights and interesting experiences to share. Paul has about a decade of experience already working in the international sector on international migration, but also on other dimensions, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, HIV/AIDS, and demographic issues. And he has experience in different regions, including the Middle East and the Asia-Pacific regions. Also has a background in research. He has coordinated and written reports and research papers and supported program development and monitoring and evaluation in different areas of the world. He's fluent. He's also fluent in English and French with a little bit of Arabic and Thai thrown in as well. Our second guest today, and I'm just going by the order that I have them on my screen. Our second guest today is Mr. Andrew Harper. Andrew is a special advisor. Andrew is a special advisor on climate action to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and is based in Geneva as well. He is responsible for providing strategic guidance, oversight, and expertise that shape UNHCR's response to the climate emergency. with the aim, of course, of making sure that the voices and the concerns of forcibly displaced people are included in key climate-related policies and processes. Prior to this assignment, he was also the director of the Division of Program and Support and Management, where he was in charge of overseeing program policy, planning, and management, as well as technical support to field operation. His a previous assignment also included leading the innovation service in UNHCR and leading and coordinating the international response to the Syria crisis based in Jordan. And one of his main achievements was the establishment of the Zaatari and Azraq refugee camps to ensure that more than 600,000 Syrian refugees were provided with the needed assistance and the needed protection. Our last, but not least, speaker today is Elisabeth Duparc. Elisabeth is a program officer on climate resilience within the International Organization for Migration's Climate Action Division. Elisabeth works more specifically on the interlinkages between migration, environment, climate change, and disaster risk reduction and urbanization. So you will see that this type of background is also providing a bit of a nice link to some of the discussions that we had in the previous week when we looked, for example, at crisis response and disaster response as well. Elisabeth has conducted a project with the city of Paris and the academia to define and implement inclusive climate adaptation policies in Paris through a multi-stakeholder approach. She previously worked at the Norwegian Refugee Council, but she has experience as well in other UN organizations like UN Habitat, as well as the European External Action Service and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So let me take this opportunity to thank very much, to extend a very heartfelt thank you to all three speakers for joining us today. And let me move into the first round of questions that we have prepared for them today. I'm going to be asking, as I said, a first round of questions, and then I'm going to stop and see if we have any reactions from the floor. So if you have any questions, that is the first moment when we're going to stop and collect some questions from the floor. Otherwise, I'm going to move into the second round, and we will save some time for Q&A towards the second part of the session. Now, let me start by asking my first question to Paul. So Paul, one of the things that we explore in this course is the role of the ILO specifically in promoting decent employment opportunities and rights at work. And the resolution and conclusions on the just transition by the ILC, the International Labour Conference General Discussion Committee, emphasizes very much the importance of understanding and addressing the impacts of climate change on labor mobility by applying a rights-based approach, a rights-based lens. So can you tell us a bit more about how the ILO contributes to addressing the risks and opportunities that are associated often with climate-induced displacement, but also how the organization works towards integrating this rights-based approach in the context of human mobility that happens in the context of climate change specifically. So thank you very much for being here with us today. And Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Miki. Thanks to my sort of fellow panelists, and hi to everyone joining online. It's really great to see you all. I'm really glad that we've got such great attendance. So, I think this is a really important question. I think in a sense, how we contribute to this sort of rights discussion is because, I think it's something that's kind of true for everyone, is that everyone at some point will end up in the labor market in one way or another. And being in this sort of, in the world of work, it's not purely an economic issue, it's also a social issue. And ultimately, it's very much about sort of making sure that this is human-centered and rights-based. So for us, it's really the key that everyone who is involved in the labor market in whichever way possible has access, is able to enjoy their rights, regardless of their status. And so that's kind of our starting point when we address this issue of climate-induced displacement, climate-induced mobility, or mobility in the context of climate change. For us, it's really about making sure that the people involved in this are able to enjoy their rights at work, their fundamental rights at work, and decent work. Now, what's also very critical for ILO are sort of concepts of social justice and inequality. And I think that's really important when we sort of take, when we adopt a certain lens to looking at people and people's vulnerabilities and people's situations in the workplace, and whether they are actually able to enjoy these rights or not. And especially in the context of climate change, where, as we know, we are dealing with impacts that are very unequal, both in terms of unequal impacts on communities where people are coming from, but also unequal opportunities in destinations, so where migrant workers are found. So yeah, we really see decent work as kind of a red thread throughout this whole discussion. It's a right, it's something that people should enjoy, but it's also an enabler of other rights, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when we're talking about poverty reduction, when we're talking about the right to development, work is really at the heart of that. And this is also true, of course, of social protection, which is another key pillar of this, that, social protection is a right. And it's also an enabler of greater resilience to sort of all sorts of shocks, including, of course, climate shocks, and something that can really play a key role in enabling social development, social progress, etc. So sort of trying to look at this a little bit sort of practically throughout the different steps of the migration cycle. Well, first of all, I think it's really, this rights-based approach is really important in building that resilience, so that migration or mobility is a choice and not a necessity. This is important because, again, everyone should really have the right, and that word again, to find sort of decent work and make a decent living wherever they are. But also because we see that when people move out of in a situation of desperation, because of a need to escape a certain impact, a climate impact amongst others, this is something that can really facilitate, unfortunately, further rights abuse, whether that be sort of workplace exploitation, even trafficking, unfair recruitment, and so on. So a first step is really making sure that people have decent work where they are, to help build their resilience. I mean, I know that there are some shocks big. We can't necessarily, it's not to say someone has a decent job and therefore, they're fine when a cyclone comes. Not really, but certainly for many of these elements, decent work really helps people build their resilience and to be able to make plans for their future. And so, to give an example, we worked on a project with UNHCR, with IOM, also with the platform on disaster displacement, who I think you've also come across in this course. We worked in a project in East Africa, in the region covered by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, on a big project on climate and mobility, and really the part that we were working on specifically was really trying to work with communities to help them to build their adaptive capacity through creating decent and green jobs. So it's about partly adaptation in countries or communities of origin through decent work. A second step is sort of when we look at this idea of how migration can actually contribute to that greater adaptive capacity. We agree that is certainly possible, but we also feel that it's really important, again, to take that rights-based approach, because we know that yes, in principle, someone going abroad or moving to the cities could find a better job, could earn wages, could earn, send remittances back, which could be invested in adaptive work. But the problem, I think, there is that you heard the word could a lot. So it's very conditional. It depends on certain set of things happening. And for us, again, one of those key things is that person really having their rights at work respected? Because the example that we would use is, someone is having to pay huge recruitment fees. They've taken out a loan in order to migrate in the first place. Yes, they may be sending back lots of money, but that money is probably going to pay back a loan. It's not going to actually support those adaptive activities, the livelihoods, diversification that we've been talking about in many ways. Similarly, if someone is in a situation of forced labor, I mean, I think fundamentally that is a problem because nobody should be in a situation of forced labor, but that certainly won't contribute to adaptation and frankly may make the situation worse. And I think even when we're looking at the skills dimension, it's still really important. We do see skill development as more or less a right of people, not just sort of an economic necessity or an economic sort of tool, but actually something which is important in the course of people's lives. And again, if we are going to talk about this sort of decent work, people being able to develop skills to address climate change, they need to have that. They need to be able to enjoy those rights. So an example of how we're sort of supporting that is in the Pacific, where we're looking at how bilateral labor migration agreements can be made more appropriate for climate adaptation. And ITC, ILO, and IOM have been partners in that work. We're also looking at the issue of adaptation in the workplace. So again, the right to a safe and healthy workplace is one of the fundamental principles and rights at work of the ILO, and climate change really puts it, is a real threat to this. And and when we say it's fundamental, that means it applies to all workers, regardless of their status, whether they are migrants, whether they are in a regular or an irregular situation. So when we think about the issue of heat stress, for example, I mean, we have some pretty outrageous, frankly, figures on the impact of heat stress in the workplace, that 80% of all workers are exposed to excessive heat in the workplace, and this is leading to 82,000 deaths per year, work-related deaths per year, just due to heat stress in the workplace. So that's huge. And really, really concerning. And for me, it's fundamentally an adaptation issue. But it's also solvable. I mean, these are deaths that can be prevented through quite, straightforward measures. But for that, you need an understanding of that right. That a safe and healthy working environment is a right. And you also need another right, which is also fundamental, which is freedom of association and collective bargaining, basically the ability for workers and employers, especially for workers in this case, to be able to sort of join together and have their voices heard, to make their concerns heard by management, which can then actually lead to developing collaborative solutions. Then, of course, we get to the issue of the potential contribution to a just transition. I mean, I think there the rights angle is very, very clear. We can't have a just transition without justice, as the saying kind of goes. So we can't create a better, greener economy, which is fairer, if migrant workers are still being exploited. And unfortunately, we do see that, a green job is not always synonymous in the real world with decent job. Taking the example of those who work in waste management and recycling, this is the classic kind of low status, low pay, dangerous work that migrant workers end up having to do. So we really need to make sure that migrant workers involved in these green sectors have their rights respected and have decent work. And a last point, and then I think I will stop there because I talked a lot. But we do also think that rights are really important when we're talking about recovery. So decent work is an enabler of recovery. It helps people to get back on their feet financially after a disaster. But it's also an outcome. And again, talking about how work and this sort of labor market relationship is not purely economic, we know that work is kind of also a marker of status, and getting to a situation of decent work is also a way of getting back to, or getting to a status of feeling recovered, retaining or gaining a position within the community, within the family. And that's really important to help rebuild livelihoods, but also to rebuild people's dignity. And we can go into that a little bit more afterwards. But I hope that answered your question, and happy to engage further in the discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you very much for your response, and thank you for really articulating so you talk about how decent work is a right and an enabler as well, and you were, I think, very effective in articulating how the different components sort of combine with each other to create this wider view and this wider approach. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for the emphasis on social protection as well. And I'm going to pick on that specifically because that's a very integral part of the group work that the participants are also going to be doing and continue to do throughout the different weeks and the different sessions of the course. So this is a little shout out to participants to keep your ears maybe particularly tuned to some of the keywords that you may hear being used throughout the sessions. So thank you very much, and let me move maybe to the next speaker, and I would like to pose the next question to Andrew, who is representing UNHCR, and look a little bit more at the protection angle. So UNHCR is the UN agency that is mandated to protect and assist refugees. And we have discussed already a little bit throughout the course about the nuances, let's say, and the specificities of using the label refugee, especially when it comes to movement that happens in the context of climate change. But UNHCR has a mandate to protect refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. So can you tell us more, perhaps, about how UNHCR approaches climate displacement within the framework of its protection mandate? And if you have any examples of how UNHCR ensures that climate-related mobility is addressed in ways that also uphold international refugee law and human rights. Thank you, Andrew. Over to you.
That's very easy questions to deal with. I just basically sort of start off and sort of saying it's becoming increasingly challenging. If you talk to refugees coming across from, let's say, Somalia to Kenya, or from Afghanistan to Pakistan, or a host of other areas where we've got conflict, the initial displacement could be conflict, but then they like, and this is also one of the challenges or one of the issues, is that people focus on the cross-border movements, but the vast majority of people being displaced by climate change or environmental degradation or a whole host of other areas look for safety and security internally, or as from the ILO perspective, they look for jobs internally, they look for support internally, and it's only a last resort before they move across the border. And so this is where we have to be focused much more on how do you provide protection regimes and support in country, so people have got an option before they actually have got to look for international protection by crossing a border. And so just talking, as I mentioned before, about Somalis going to Kenya or to Ethiopia, many of them being impacted by the conflict internally within Somalia, but then they try and stay and stay. But then after 4 or 5 years of drought, and then after some of the record floods that they've experienced, they've got no choice. They will search for health, they will search for education, they will search for a future for their children. And so when they cross, the last straw was probably the drought, but the first straw was probably the conflict. And so this is where it starts becoming an issue, and it's good to have IOM on board, because it's the issue of forced displacement or refugee or migration is becoming increasingly interlinked. That being said, we are a protection agency, as you mentioned, and so we are concerned about those people who have been forced to move and have been displaced due to conflict. And so our first priority is to deal with people who have already been forced to move due to conflict and who may find themselves in areas which are being impacted by climate change, because these are the areas which no one else wants. It's where refugees and IDPs find themselves, because no one actually believes it's habitable or livable. And I'd also go back to a point that Paul mentioned, was that it's going to be really scary in the future if you start looking at issues of heat stress and compounded hazards, because these areas where people are located, let's look at the 700,000 people who have gone from Sudan into Chad. They've gone to places which are not habitable, hardly habitable now. So what is it going to be like when it becomes even worse in the future? And so this is the type of mapping that we're looking at. But going back to your question, what we try and do is we break down human mobility. And human mobility, according to the UNFCCC, it looks at forced displacement, which is what we're concerned about, migration, and planned relocation. So there's enough people on the move for us just to focus as much as possible on the protection needs of refugees and IDPs. So what do we do to try and do it? We work in support of states. And so we try and ensure that we're not looking to expand the Refugee Convention, point number one. What we do try and do is ensure that states are provided with the support and the, let's say, the guidance that they can use existing laws, regimes effectively. And so first thing that we do, there's four steps that we provide that support. So we provide interpretation and the effective application of refugee law. We also provide help in terms of jurisprudence and support of legislation, in terms of how countries could interpret refugee law in an evolving manner. Because like we're talking about climate change now, but in the past, we could be also, there was no consideration of LGBTQI. There was very little consideration of gender. So over time, refugee law evolves. And so what we try and do is also provide that support. And we do that through our executive committee and guidance to states. Also, to basically provide that guidance in a way which people can understand, we also come out with regular, let's say, guidance notes. And so in 2020, we came out with a legal considerations paper regarding claims for international protection made in the context of adverse effects of climate change and disaster. You know that title was made up by a lawyer because it covers everything, and it certainly doesn't fit within a tweet. And also, again, almost like all of us, whether it be ILO, IOM, or UNHCR, or almost anyone, like if states are asking for technical guidance, then we provide it. So there's a lot of discussions, particularly in Africa, about what are their obligations, how can they do more. Just recently, we've provided support to Brazil, Cameroon, Colombia, Nigeria, the Philippines, Somalia, and sort of like try and help states interpret regimes and mechanisms to protect people. So the question I know was about international protection, but what we generally find is the most pragmatic protection is when you focus on the state and help them. If you start looking at international covenants, then you've probably lost it, particularly where the world is going at the moment. So providing that pragmatic protection, helping states interpret existing laws, coming up with regional instruments is super important. There's good examples as well, like and let's also face it, in the current context of the world, is the world going to enhance refugee instruments? No way. So we work with regional entities because that's probably the best way of doing it. Just as climate change doesn't differentiate between borders, people will also move across borders in order to search for safety. So things like the 1969 OAU Convention, the Organization of African Union Convention, which recognized that people were in need if there's disruption in terms of the state's ability to protect people. Also, there was a recent EGAD came out with a Article 16, again, talking about providing protection for people being forced to leave their homes due to environment and climate change. IOM's been doing some good work with states in terms of the Kampala Declaration. So across the board, there's Cartagena 40th anniversary this year. So across the board, we don't sort of fixated on the 951 Convention, although that is our bedrock. We sort of see, okay, what is the best means to provide protection? And what is something which is conducive to a regional, to a region to ensure that is supported. So there's something else which is certainly important is the platform and disaster displacement. That's a follow-up to the Nansen initiative. I know ILO has been very much engaged as partnering with UNHCR on these type of things. You also would have heard about the UNFCCC, the Warsaw Implementation Mechanism, the Task Force on Displacement. So there's not a shortage of platforms and mechanisms, but what I think we increasingly have to do is to look at what is the context and what is acceptable and viable for the countries that are specifically asking for that support. Is it a country level advising? Is it an opinion? Is it trying to capacitate regional entities that have got the laws on the books, but they've not operationalized them? So, for instance, if you look at the Organization African Union, great laws and statutes, but what are they doing actually the implementation? And this is where, when we go to events like COP, it's no use just talking about international protection unless it's backed up with money. Countries need that support in order to ensure that they can provide support to refugees. Can't go to a country like Kenya and say, okay, please provide access to your labor force unless they also see there's a net benefit for them. And so this also requires not only that development assistance, but also requires evidence and data to back what we're saying. So, for instance, again with IOM, we've been doing a lot of work with the Venezuelans in South America. We've been able to demonstrate through work with the World Bank that when refugees cross, just as migrants would cross, they can actually improve the overall economic well-being of a particular country. So there's something to be gained from it. So if we can also provide that support in terms of getting development or climate support in those areas, it helps with the overall protection. I'll basically wrap it up there, but just sort of saying this is an area that's going to become increasingly important. But as it moves forward, it becomes even increasingly blurred, because why people are moving is going to be up for more and more challenges. And if you ask 15 people why do they cross a border, the same border, they'll have 15 different answers. So it's not as simple as sort of saying there was a conflict and people are moving. People will move internally, and then last resort they'll cross a border. What we are seeing is that these international protection regimes are going to become even more important, because the ability of people to return back in safety and dignity is going to be increasingly jeopardized because conflicts are not being resolved. And climate change and environmental degradation is leaving less opportunities for people to return back to enjoy the livelihoods and lifestyles and opportunities that they had before. So on top of the, let's say, the push for displacement that's happening around the world, you've also got to take into account the urbanization issues too, the change in livelihoods. So in that context, when you talk about international protection, it is not just about refugees. It is about a changing world and how we're going to be addressing that changing world, which ensures that protection is provided to everyone in a way which certainly addresses the most vulnerable first. So I'll just leave it at that. Over.
Thank you, Andrew, for this very inspiring, I would say, response. And I like how you highlighted very well on the one hand, the increasing complexity, but also the multiplicity of drivers, I would say, that contribute to a person's decision to move. So the increasing complexity of the drivers behind displacement, and leading to more and more nuanced types of movement across border and within borders. So looking at more flows of migrations that are becoming more and more mixed, and therefore potentially more difficult to address, which calls for a more coordinated and integrated response. And I like also the way that you linked this evolution in a way of the reality, this change in the reality to the need of the protection regimes, starting from the legal regimes to the different legal mechanisms, to also evolve alongside it, and also to work to try and bridge the gap, I would say, between the words on the paper and the implementation of the ground. So I think you painted a very good picture of that, and I like how your response also, in a way, brought us back a bit to, and I'm referring to the participants again, to this idea of the humanitarian development peace nexus that we've been we were discussing last week, and showing how really trying to respond to emerging crises in today's world, including the crisis and the risks that might be posed by mobility in the context of the adverse effects of climate change, requires this sort of integrated approach that really looks at the different dimensions of the nexus. So thank you very much for highlighting this. Elizabeth, I would move then perhaps with a question to you about the role of IOM and the activities of IOM. So IOM, the International Organization for Migration, has experience in both migration-related and climate-related matters. And can you tell us how the organization can leverage its partnerships, existing partnerships and relationships with the governments, with the NGOs, with other stakeholders that may be involved, to advocate for comprehensive and inclusive international governance approaches that can address this complex dynamic, this complex link between climate change and human mobility. Over to you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Miki. Thank you for the invitation. And nice to see you all. I mean, I don't see you all, but I hope I can hear you soon. And thank you for my fellow panelists. I think we've covered already quite a broad range of of projects that we've been working together on, and initiatives, and also the common kind of goals that within the UN. I think it's quite important. Well, actually, your question is quite timely, because we just came back from COP, and over there, we, in terms of collaboration, in terms of, governance, there's a lot to say about that, about who we're collaborating with, from governments to, at all levels, including a local level. And I like that Andrew, insisted on the urbanization, because I think it's a key, a key level to work with, and IOM thinks so too. So that's a good news. And also, with CSOs and youth and many other communities. So just to start, I don't know if you're all familiar with what IOM is doing, but basically just to start on. So we're committed for to promote human and dignified migration, and think that it can be of benefit for all, for both migration and society as a whole. And having that in mind, IOM has been working for a few decades on the topic, and changed names over time a couple of times. And we set up this division, the Climate Action Division, and defined the institutional strategy. Just long story short, to talk a bit about the objectives of IOM on the topic, with 3 objectives. So we are, and that's in collaboration again with many stakeholders, including our other UN agencies and other stakeholders. And I'll give a couple of examples afterwards. But basically, we try to find solution for people to move. So typically migration as a climate adaptation strategy, including in the context of labor migration, as as Paul mentioned, and then solution for people on the move. Typically, Paul and Andrew mentioned extreme heat a lot, and I think it's a major topic on which IOM is increasingly working on. For both our team, right? So at the operational level, and so in their work with migrants, and obviously for migrants themselves. So for example, finding shelter solution for migrant displaced, suffering from extreme heat, to be very concrete. And then solution for people to stay. So talking about disaster risk management. And so there's been a bit of change within IOM, but in short, we're covering obviously a lot on disaster risk reduction, and disaster is is a specific topic, right? Because we cover climate change, environmental degradation, and disaster risk reduction. Knowing that disaster is socio-economically constructed, right? So people talk a lot about natural disasters. We talk about disaster, and the UN entities do as well. Knowing that, right, that socio-economically constructed, that people most vulnerable to disasters are located in exposed areas, and that disaster is not it's not a natural event, right? That knowing that, then the decision and what IOM is doing, and at the operational level, is highly influenced by the vulnerability that people face. I know we'll talk about gender a bit later on. That's one of the example of kind of the focus of IOM, in the operational kind of activities. Now, just to come back to the solution that I was mentioning, IOM is the leading convener on the topic, and so the idea is to promote policy coherence and partnership to mainstream the inclusion of migration and displacement and in the climate change and agenda and other agenda, including environment, disaster, and there was the COP now, the climate COP. Few know, I think it's less known, but there were also the COP on biodiversity last month in Cali, in Colombia, and next month the COP on desertification, right, in Saudi Arabia. And I think there are a lot of talks on whether to merge those three COPs. If one shadows the others, I think it's an interesting conversation. So basically the idea of mainstreaming migration into these agendas, including desertification, including biodiversity, is one of the key pillars of our collaboration with governance and with our fellow, the fellow UN entities. And Andrew mentioned it, but for example, so we developed kind of 3 regional frameworks in Africa, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. Again, I say we, it was always in collaboration, like for example, in the Pacific, by the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and who took the lead, and the Kampala Declaration, was led by the government of Uganda, and then in the Caribbean, Eastern Caribbean to be more precise. And those 3 frameworks are key, demonstration of the willingness of the government to come together at the regional levels and almost continental levels. If we take the example of Africa, because 37 countries signed this declaration. On mainstreaming migration and displacement into different practices, including social inclusion and livelihoods, climate mitigation and adaptation, finance and investment. So the idea is not only to kind of merge the 2 fields, if we can say, but also to mainstream it in other areas. And then also, like, we support the policy coherence. So what does that mean concretely? It also means that support the inclusion of migration and displacements into climate and environmental policy, but also the other way around, right? And if I take the example of for example, urbanization, because it's the topic I'm working on the most, right? You were mentioning and I did it on purpose, the project with Paris. I like talking about this example because clearly the implication of the local level and the local stakeholders is critically important, because cities are on the forefront of migration and climate change. So clearly they're on the front line of both topic. And we did this project with Paris, but again with the city of Paris, but also with researchers, with academia, with local organization, local CSOs. I think it was great because architects, kind of various field, and I think this kind of interdisciplinary work is what we're striving for, including in all UN organizations and in many organizations. And we came up with recommendations, and including one of the pillars was obviously employment, given the impact of this on the daily life of migrants and also of the receiving communities. So yeah, like the increasing employment opportunities in the field of ecological transition, but also, and I think that's an important part of like mobilizing migrants' knowledge and skills as part of disaster risk reduction plans, right? While taking account of their vulnerabilities. And that, I think, there are a lot of best practices coming from governments, including at the local level, on mobilizing displaced people, asylum seekers, refugees, as volunteers, for example, in fire brigade. It's done in Germany, for example. So just to give a bit of example. And then also I wanted to mention in that context of urbanization, the great work of, for example, organizations like C40 Cities and the Mayor's Migration Council. We've been doing a great job at, having those kind of bringing the cities together, of mayors together and joint forces to achieve to more, durable result, and mobilizing finance, actually more and more climate finance at the local level. So this is great as well. And then just a couple of words on, we have a specific division working on labor migration, and Paul is working a lot with them, I think, and with us directly as well. But to mention just a project that we've been doing on, kind of mobilizing skills mobility partnership and all the skills programming for migrant workers. We've been working with diaspora, and I think it's definitely a big, actor, stakeholder in that field. We've been having this Diaspora for Climate Action, which aims to engage diaspora communities in the UK from different countries, and to kind of involve them in strategic climate change documents. So that's one of the examples. I see that I talk a lot, and we don't realize that we're talking a lot when we're talking. So I'm wrapping up, and just to come up with, because I started with that, to finish with COP, the last COP, because we came back 3 days ago. We've been mobilizing a lot, and I think that's something that IOM is really, pushing for, is the collaboration with the civil society representative, with indigenous communities, for example, and also with youth. And we've been kind of collaborating with 24th Youth to go to COP, and we've seen that they are to enable a diversity of voices, and in the events, but also in the negotiations. And I think it was great. It was great. I think the media kind of picked up this thing as well. To have more diversity of voice, I think the kind of public space is ready for that, and we saw that with those amazing youth voices. So just to finish on that, thank you.
Fantastic, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. It was very passionate, and I could tell that you were very passionate about the Paris project, and I think it was an interesting addition to the discussion as well, because it manages very well the transition from, let's say, looking at the governance framework at the very high global level, then bringing it down to the regional, to the national, and then to the local, and the engagement of the local authorities, the local actors, including civil society organizations and diaspora communities. So I thought that was a very nice arc. There's a key word that you mentioned, but I am going to come back to that in a little while, because I would like to see first if we have any questions from the floor directed at our panelists today. So if you do have any questions, reflections, reactions to anything that has been said that you would like to share in plenary, please do not hesitate to raise your hand virtually with the reaction function at the bottom of your screen, or type your comments, your thoughts in the chat box. And perhaps while we wait for participants to gather their thoughts, I'm going to go back to the keyword that I heard you mention, which is policy coherence. Elizabeth, in your discussion, in your response to my initial question, and policy coherence is really crucial when we look at the specific challenges that are posed by migration that happens in the context of climate change. And so I wanted to hear, so you told us already a little bit about IOM, but I was wondering if you wanted to expand a little bit on the work that IOM is doing to promote policy coherence, and if the other colleagues would like to come in as well, if there's any work that is being done at the moment by the respective organizations to address the potential the potential gaps or inconsistencies between migration policies, protection frameworks, and climate change, and policies that are more related to the technical aspects of climate change. So it's a bit of a question for all the three of you. Let me know if you would like to expand a little bit more about the issue of policy coherence. And I don't know if maybe Elizabeth, you want to add a little bit on what you had mentioned earlier about coherence, policy coherence first, or if Paul, if you would like to go first, let me know by waving or opening
Andrew,
your
I think you
microphone.
can go next, yeah. So I don't speak after myself.
Shall I go? I would actually say like climate change should be the thing that be bringing everyone together. Because as I mentioned, things are just so big and so represent such an existential threat to everyone that working individually is just nonsensical. When we're talking about population movements of potentially hundreds of millions of people, where everyone is being impacted, whether we're talking about urbanization, we're talking about stranded populations, we're talking about human security here. And within those vulnerable populations, you do have gender issues, you do have migration issues, you do have planned relocation issues, you do have conflict. But I would still say when we're working not necessarily in a coherent manner that the situation requires. Will it happen? It has to happen. There is, I think, the tolerance of many countries to go it alone, for agencies to go alone, have reached a breaking point. And so we like the more the collaboration, the better. And I think like on the PDD and increasingly on the task force and displacement, like we do have ILO, UNHCR, and I are working together. There's no doubt there's hiccups and challenges with that, but we have to reinforce that. But also then that needs to be going into UNDP. Then it needs to be going into UNICEF. We need to be going into FAO, and we need to be going. But then beyond that, that's all just talk and policy if you don't have the money. So then we need to be getting the Green Climate Fund on board, and we need to be getting the Adaptation Fund on board. But these funding institutions should not be supporting agencies who just go it alone or just come up with a very standalone approach, because we need to have much more of a holistic, let's say, engagement, which includes a whole of society approach. And so one of the key elements that we had last year for the Global Refugee Forum was the inclusion of refugees. But we also need to have the inclusion of indigenous populations. We also need to have inclusion of migrants. So we need to be working together in order to ensure that everyone who's being impacted has that opportunity to be included in, again, development initiatives, but also climate response, climate adaptation activities. So we've got to be working much more towards that common objective. I think the push at COP for a common, let's say, common advocacy points, particularly through the IASC and else, that was super. So it doesn't matter whether it's IOM or UNHCR or ILO or OCHA, we should all be able to represent each other's interests, because in the end, we shouldn't be working for ourselves. We need to be working for those populations who are particularly vulnerable. And if we don't do that, then we're doing a disservice to them. Over.
Thank you, Andrew. Paul, is there anything that you would like to complement, perhaps, on again on this issue of policy coherence, or Elizabeth, if you would wish to come back as well on the topic? Over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously to agree very enthusiastically with what Andrew said, and yeah, and thanks to Elizabeth also for bringing that point up. I mean, it's just so critical, and there's a need to work, on every sector, and looking at the interrelationships between each element. We look at the workplace and we look at all the populations in the workplace, but that's one element of people's lives. Then there's the element of their housing, the cities they're living in, which is related to perhaps the work of Habitat that Habitat's doing, the protection, which is UNHCR. I think, yeah, you could probably go crazy trying to do all of this by yourself, and we don't have enough people, frankly. Again, sort of coming back from COP, I mean, we were a delegation of, I don't know how many, probably about 8 people at any given time, and that's just not enough to cover all the work that there is. So we need to collaborate. We need that common advocacy that Andrew was talking about. We need to sort of make sure that we're all sort of passing on the same messages in the different spaces we're engaging in, so that the people are hearing the same messages. Because of course, on the question of mobility and migration on the one side is huge. The question of climate on the other side is also huge and all-encompassing. So we also need to make it easy for those who have very little familiarity with the world of mobility and migration, for whom, they may think about it in ways that we might say, oh, that's very simplistic, but, who can blame them? They're just, they're struggling just to keep up with the state of the art in the field that they're in. So we need to make it very clear for them how all of these elements fit together. So yeah, I think coherence is absolutely critical. Working together, adopting that whole of society approach, and I mean, really highlighting, how these impacts are differential, that it's not always, that they're not always equal, but that there are, I think, some sort of common underlying principles, and especially the rights-based approach, that can sort of help us to really address this in a coherent fashion. So yeah, absolutely, very much in agreement. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Elizabeth, did you want to also come in a little bit, or should we?
No, thank you. I think I can only agree with what was said, and I think there is no possibility of not agreeing. I mean, indeed, it's so the challenges are so daunting that definitely together is better. And I think we've understood that. And again, to come back to COP, in the negotiation, that's what was, like we advocated for all the time, is to have migrant, refugee, displaced people always, brought together and when relevant in the context of labor migration or labor, labor work, labor, agreement to make it relevant as well as a whole, right? So yeah, that's it. Agree.
Thank you very much. Then, if there are no questions, I don't see any questions at the moment in the chat, and I don't see any raised hands. But let me extend once again. There it is. I just called it. So we do have indeed one question coming up in the chat, and it is a question from Wanya. One is asking, what are the biggest challenges being faced by ensuring the all of government and all of society approaches? And Wanya, is this directed specifically? Do you want to hear specifically from one of our panelists, or this is more a question that is directed to the panel in its entirety, and you want to hear the different perspectives come in? For everyone. So I will let you maybe decide if there's I see the Paul is taking notes. So Andrew, can we start with you then and do the same as we did before? Thank you.
Well, I think we have to put ourselves in the position of the governments and sort of say, do they have the resources? And certainly on the refugee front, if you've got Chad, who's already hosting, I don't know, 500,000 people, and then they get another 500,000 people coming in, they don't have too many natural resources. It's basically a country devoid of a lot of things that we take for granted. So it's tough for them to have a whole of society approach, including refugees and migrants, if they're struggling to deal with the needs of their own citizens. And so what climate change is doing is actually undermining the resilience of governments to meet their social contract. And so what we need to be doing as an international community is not look for more refugees to occur. We need to try and ensure, how do we secure peace? How do we value peace? How do we value security in these areas? Noting that you still have mega trends, like you people are changing livelihoods, people are moving to urbanized areas, but it's it's and we saw it at COP, like the international community is not prioritizing countries that are being impacted by climate change and who are vulnerable. Like there is hundreds of millions, hundreds of billions of dollars being spent on AI development. So don't tell me the money's not out there, but the money is not being invested in people. It's still being invested in profits. There's still $1 trillion being made by petrochemical companies and states. So it's to say that we should accept a target of $300 billion and then still be happy that there was $700 million pledged last. Like we're not talking on the same plane. It's like we're like what I am seeing is that there's a distraction. Countries are basically trying to distract us from some of the key issues that need to be addressed, and we're buying it. Like we saw it at COP. There was a whole lot of initiatives distracting people from the key elements which we need to be addressing, which were the financial targets, the quantifiable goals, and trying to reduce emissions. So if we're not going to be serious at places like COP or through the UNFCCC process, then we have to be much more dogmatic and sort of demanding support for those populations and those communities most in need to help them so that they can be inclusive. Over.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. Paul, over to you, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, sort of being very much again in agreement. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue is also just, climate change has not perhaps historically been appreciated how like wide the impacts are. And what I see from sort of the Labour perspective, at least, for example, is there'll be a discussion on the transition of the energy system, and it's seen as an issue of Ministry of Environment, maybe Ministry of Energy, if that's how it's set up, but it's not seen as a Labour issue. So for us, it's really, it's really about sort of, and I'm saying that from the Labour perspective. If you had someone from WHO, they would come and say, well, it's also a health issue, and they'd be absolutely right. So it's definitely part of like a big part of it is just sort of having that initial understanding that this is really something that affects every area of society, every area of the economy, where we need sort of all hands on deck to everyone to be involved in the solutions, and to sort of to address this. And I mean, one thing I was reading, I mean, a little bit anecdotal, but I think it's useful kind of reflection, is that at the COP, the issue was that this was the finance COP, but there weren't really many people with a finance background in the government delegations. So they didn't talk the language of finance. And perhaps the finance people aren't talking the language of climate. So that's possibly also where some of these incoherence, some of this incoherence was coming in. So it's really all about, I think it's really important to sort of have that perspective that this is the responsibility of all areas of government and all areas of society too, and to sort of set up those kinds of structures to address that sort of common responsibility, and to just to help think through where that might be. I mean, it's not a question of us people coming in from outside and saying this is what you need to do, but it's just sort of, I think, the process of having that conversation and sort of saying, well, okay, this is the Labour dimension of this element, that's really, really critical. So yeah, just my thoughts there. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Elizabeth, anything that you would also like to contribute on this?
No, thank you. I think we can move on to other question. I agree.
Thank you. Thank you. I saw that there were 2 raised hands and one is still there. So Jacques, I would pass the floor to you for your interventions. And then I believe the other one was from Madhushika, if I'm not mistaken. And then we can move to that one in a little bit. So Jacques, over to you. Thank you very much.
For sure. Thanks for having me, and thanks so much for your kind of, explaining the kind of state of play to us at the moment. That was really, really interesting to hear. I mostly have a question for sorry, I most have a question for Andrew, but I would be keen to hear generally the panel as well. But mostly I was wondering, and it's something I've been thinking a lot recently, is are we still seeing the value in summits like COP, or should we be pivoting to supporting more regional and local initiatives that are context responsive rather than trying to generate policies from the top down? Paul gave a good rebuttal to this actually when he kind of mentioned that a common rights-based approach among people is important and is something we should pursue. Then as kind of Andrew came back in his last response, he mentioned that, the more powerful members of the international communities, like their priorities are not aligned with the actual key issues related to climate change and migration and labor and conflict that need to be addressed. So I'm wondering, are we still seeing, the outcomes we want to be seeing from COP, or should we be looking at more kind of, regional initiatives and moving the funding away from these kind of big international summits to something a bit more localized and context specific?
If I can just sort of quickly go back to Jacques, I think what I do get frustrated on is just the overemphasis on COP as the be all and end all. And meanwhile, you've got 60,000 people being displaced, 60,000 displacements per day due to extreme weather events. So if we put all our sort of like hope in a COP, we're going to be severely disappointed, and we're not going to do justice to the people who are being displaced. There was a reference during COP by, I think it was one of the banks, and they said, look, you humanitarians are always going to be disappointed because our timeline does not match yours. Like they're talking 5-year stock takes. We're talking, oh my God, what's going to happen in Chad or Ukraine, or so we're talking at different levels. That being said, we have to be involved in COP. We have to be pushing the access, the profile, the advocacy of people who are in particular need, and we need the voices there. I spoke to a number of, as we all have, spoken to a number of people representing SIDS and LDCs, and they were saying this is the only forum where we have this chance to be listened to. So even though it's not perfect, much like the United Nations, it's better than what else we've got. In terms of the financing side of things, I've seen very little progress on the fund for the responding to loss and damage. So if you're waiting for that, and you've got to deal with people's lives, then you're failing. So I'd have the COP and the loss and damage fund, for instance, as one option amongst a whole range. So we've been working with the World Bank, IDA. We've increasingly engaged with the Green Climate Fund. We're increasingly engaged with the Adaptation Fund, the private sector, philanthropists. So it's a situation where it's still very important, but you shouldn't put it as sort of like as the ivory tower. It's because it doesn't address our specific needs in the manner which is required. Others may have a different approach, but I think there is, if you see the response from those countries who are looking for a much more ambitious commitment in terms of financial and the financing of the new quantifiable goals, they're saying it was like a disaster, it was a betrayal. I think it's probably almost what we expected with the change in the US election, with what's going on in Europe. So we have to probably pivot a bit in terms of looking at other instruments and other possibilities. And this is where we have to sort of be thinking out of the box. I'd also say that the partnerships that we had in the past probably should not dictate the partnerships that we have in the future, because the world is just changing so rapidly. So it's nice to work within the UN, but we should not be reliant on the UN for having the answers. We just got to try and figure out who does have the answers. Over.
Thank you, Andrew. I wonder if because I know that Jacques, you mentioned the question being directed specifically at Andrew, but being interested in hearing also the other panelists' perspectives. So if you have anything to add, please do, Elizabeth and Paul. Otherwise, yes, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know. I think it's an interesting conversation because I think it's in light of, I think we expected indeed not a great, amazing, like kind of like the result that I mean, still 24 hours before the end of the thing, like we were expecting no deal, right? And I had this conversation this morning, but is a bad deal worse than a no deal, right? So that's kind of, and I think it's open to interpretation and to discussion, endless conversation around that, and everyone has a different opinion, I think. Just the element I wanted to raise here is I mentioned in the biodiversity COP and the desertification COP, and the climate COP obviously has such a big visibility, and I still think it's positive that countries are coming together in a year with so many polarization, like geopolitical differences and complication around the world. So it remains positive, depends how we want to see the glass half full, half empty. But definitely the role of biodiversity is concerning for me in this, in this field. Considering the impact it has on climate directly, on migrants and refugees and displaced people directly as well, and it's not, enough taken into account. So I would, definitely there will be other forums, other, kind of discussion around that. But recently there's been, as I was mentioning, discussion on, whether we should merge all the three COPs. And I think this needs to be taken into account, that biodiversity is a major, we mentioned a lot environmental degradation. And I think that should definitely be taken into account during the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think it's a very valid point that certainly Elizabeth raised. I think, we can't look at these things in isolation. They contribute to each other. Climate change contributes to desertification. Biodiversity is part of nature-based solutions. Mangroves as kind of just thinking of those, which can help with both carbon capture to some degree, but also protecting shorelines against storm surges and typhoons and this kind of thing. So I think there's definitely an argument for looking at them all together. I mean, from my perspective, and maybe this is just someone who's been in the UN system too long, I think sort of it's sort of twofold. Is that one is yes, it's global and it moves at the pace of the slowest, but the alternative would be to have a system which would be full of holes. This is, I think, going back to international relations, introduction to international relations, this is almost the archetypical, like, perfect situation of a common action problem. So I think the COP, the UNFCCC regime really what it really looks to do is to, create a situation where everyone has a say, everyone has a buy-in, because ultimately, if you had a process which is just a patchwork, the risk would be, well, you have very important countries, and we see that, right? The carbon emission sort of landscape is radically different now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Who are the highest emitters now is not the same as it was relatively recently. So the risk would be, if we have such a patchwork, then we could easily see free riding. We could see countries that basically just don't engage with the process. Insofar as mitigation happens, they let others do the heavy lifting, benefit from it, and then that, I think, undermines the whole thing. So, that's, again, this is very much a personal reflection on this. The other thing, and the other point I would pick up on, sort of, on Andrew, is also what Andrew said about, it's not, COP is not an outcome. The COP is not, anyway, it doesn't happen on its own. This is all part of a process. This is COP29. There have been 28 previously, and I think what we do see, I mean, imperfectly, but we do see a ratchet, right? We see an increase. For me, the way I think about it is, and perhaps this is, again, optimistic, but it's like every time we turn the wheel a little and we tighten, we tighten it a little bit more, and I think it's important to see that this sets a floor for ambition, but it does not set a ceiling. So this is sort of setting the minimum standards. Now, obviously, we know how difficult it can be, but at least um, we do have something which can also be exceeded. So I still believe in the process, and I think it can also be complemented by regional action. I think it is in many ways. But yeah, ultimately, I mean, I think we need a process that involves everyone, that is inclusive, including those countries which may be less committed. But because otherwise, at least they still own the outcomes. That's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, very much for your response, and thank you, colleagues. Madhushika, you have been waiting very patiently with your hand raised, so please, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for this really interesting discussion. I would like to go back to a little bit from what the panelists spoke of in the beginning, especially Paul. I think you used the word resilience and working with the states on how to respond to the people who are affected and affected populations. We were talking about resilience. And I've been thinking about this concept of resilience amongst migrants. Specifically, I'm working with returning migrant workers, and we've been looking at reasons for remigration. And time and again, the majority of the reasons are financial instability. And you dig deeper, it's the inability to respond to or recover from shocks, natural disasters, etc. So this idea of resilience, I'm curious to know, is there an idea of what resilience could look like? And is there like a framework? And this, again, with, then I'm seeing the intercoherence and collaboration amongst, I mean, resilience is not just economic, it's, at multiple levels. So I'm just curious, is there anything out there right now on what resilience for people on the move or people, coming back could look like? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madhushika. I see our panelists all look very pensive and thoughtful. So I wonder if there are any takers to go first on the issue of resilience, I believe, and what resilience could look like in practice. If I understood your question correctly, Madhushika.
I mean,
thank you, Paul.
Madhushika mentioned me first, so I think that kind of means that I have to have the first go, and I think it's a really excellent and extremely relevant question, right? I mean, yes, what does resilience look like? And I think maybe sort of linking it to some of these other discussions we've been having is, I don't think we can't really say it's like one thing. I mean, I think from the ILO perspective, of course, decent work, access to social protection, we see those as key pillars of resilience, but I don't think they are the only ones, because as you say, it's very much a multi-dimensional concept, which encompasses social, economic. Would obviously be a big part of it, because there's not people's ability to react to shocks is very, very much dictated by their gender, and gendered expectations and gendered opportunities and gendered segmentation of labor markets and so on and so forth. So I think it would be a very interesting discussion to sort of have that point. I mean, I think we would talk generally about adaptation and adaptive capacity, but sort of coming to an endpoint of resilience, sort of also bearing in mind that the impacts can be quite dynamic, and of course, and resilience, I think, is also a feeling as well. There's a subjective element that from the outside you could say, actually, you should be resilient, but the person doesn't feel it. Then that doesn't really help anyone. So I think it's a question which is really well worth reflecting on, and I'd be really interested to hear what the others have to say. But thank you. That's really thought-provoking. Thanks.
Andrew, I see you've opened your microphone. Please, over to you.
Just to avoid the silence. I think again, we have to be looking about not just the resilience that communities need for today, but we need to build up the resilience to deal with the upcoming threats. Because if you look at the science and the data and the evidence, and the trends, the situation is going to get worse, obviously. And so, what does resilience mean? Does it actually mean that you're staying in place, or are we going to have to accept that populations are going to have to move? A place is going to be habitable in the future, or do we take also into account that livelihoods are changing? The whole issue of pastoralists and farmers, which people continually talk about. What is the future of pastoralism in many parts of the world when the amount of arable land is diminishing, the amount of predictable water supply is reduced, governance is falling, and if you talk to a lot of women and children, and you sort of say, "Well, do you want to maintain being a pastoralist?" They say, "Hell no." It's often the men who sort of see it as their macho culture and sort of traditions that they have to maintain. But if you talk to the women and children, they say, "We want to go to school. We want to have healthcare. We want to live in a city and get access to a future." So we often sort of default that climate change is the only issue, when there's all these other mega trends, and sometimes we're almost trying to get in the way. So what is resilience? Is resilience basically trying to hold on to a lifestyle which is not going to be viable in a not too distant future, and may not even be viable now? So I think it's more than resilience. It's about sort of adaptation to an increasingly hostile world, unfortunately. And so, but we have to go back to, what does resilience mean for these communities? It's not the men, it's not the leaders. Often there's a focus on key informants or on leaders or government officials. We need to talk to the women. We need to talk to the children. We need to be saying, okay, what is the future that you want, and how do we best support those decisions? So community engagement and community empowerment. So I know I'm not answering it, but it's there's no easy answer. Over.
Indeed, there is no easy answer, but thank you for giving it a try anyway. Elizabeth, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to take 1 minute. Yeah, so to complete what Andrew was saying, so from our side, we talk about resilience, like to make migration a choice, basically, right? And address the drivers that compel people to move. And indeed, climate drivers is usually only an aggravating factor, right? Coupled with all the other drivers, including conflict. Just a note on resilience, because it's also in the title of my work. I think there is a number of voices, trying to make sense of that word, and also being careful, because resilience can also be sometimes interpreted as like people enduring any kind of things, and being just I don't know how to express that in English. I have French coming to my mind now, but
you can go ahead in French.
Basically saying like, resilient is, people who can face everything. It's not an excuse for people it's not a reason for people to endure all those things, or to, you know what I mean? Like the kind of the resilience word should be treated carefully, and not also used at any kind of, it becomes kind of a buzzword. And indeed, resilience is having the coping mechanism, basically, that help people to address those, vulnerabilities and risk and difficulties. Yeah, that's my word. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So just because I have maybe the capacity at the moment, or the coping mechanisms, as you said, to endure, doesn't mean that I have to be subjected to certain conditions that that would be otherwise unacceptable. So thank you very much for highlighting that point, which I think is an important point. I am mindful of the time. We have reached, I think, the end of the time that we had set aside for this session. So I'm not going to open a second round of questions, because I think that would take us a little bit too much over time. But I will maybe just repeat my invitation to participants to take advantage of this last maybe minute or two, if they wish to ask any last minute questions. We can still have the time to accommodate for that. I know that there was a question in the chat that I haven't picked up in plenary, which had to do with the categorization or the of climate migrants, and whether there is a plan to expand the scope of the 1951 Convention to also recognizing climate refugees. And the reason why I haven't brought it up is that it has been answered in the chat. And I have taken the liberty, Andrew, to also add a little bit to your response and include the link to the publication that you had mentioned in your response. So I can also put it on the eCampus at the end of the session, so that you can also refer to that when you start reviewing the material for the session and for the course in general. I am looking very quickly if there is anything that I have left out in the chat, and I see that there's Abdullah Ammar as written down quite an extensive response as well. So he's saying essentially the current debate centers on whether to provide a legal definition for climate displaced people and recognize them as refugees under international law. And he's saying, well, there is a significant ongoing discussion among scholars and practitioners. The decision largely remains with the individual states. So according to the 2020 UNHCR guidance that he just quickly looked at, as you shared the reference, Andrew, there is a need to address the protection of individuals that are displaced by climate change and disasters, acknowledging the complexities within the existing international law frameworks. And the guidance suggests that although there is no specific legal definition for climate displaced persons, individuals that are fleeing due to environmental factors might still qualify for international protection if those factors intersect with situations involving persecution or severe harm. So going back to the idea that was really explained at the beginning of how climate change is not the one single driver for people to move, to find themselves in a situation of displacement, but really how the different drivers intersect with other types of prosecution, the other types of other causes for persecution or severe harm. And the last comment that Abdullah is making is that I think proving such circumstances is often extremely challenging for individuals, and that's indeed often the case. So thanks for expanding a little bit more on the point. I am seeing there are a few further, I'm seeing your raised hand, Paul. I see that there's also a couple of comments. Shamir Brown, yes, internet connection can be challenging. As you know, the session is recorded. We will put the recording on the eCampus. He's saying also, however, there have been successes where the international frameworks have been used to assist the relocation of climate migrants, and that is certainly the case. There are cases that we can show, and we can showcase them on the platform as well. Paul, I see that you have raised your hand, so please, over to you.
Thanks, Vicky. I mean, just the last point, and I think this is just really a reflection on some of this discussion, is, there are flexibilities. I mean, as Andrew pointed out, the Refugee Convention has, there has been an evolution in how refugees have been seen to encompass things like LGBTQ as a category of persecution or well-founded fear of persecution. So I think there is still flexibility in how states can see law. I mean, it's possibly a little bit of a facetious way of looking at it, but it's like the old joke of Al Capone, the greatest gangster of ever. He was of all time. He was caught on tax evasion, right? There are often other ways into addressing this topic, and I know actually there was one thing that just is worth probably highlighting is that there is this ongoing process in the International Court of Justice, and this was something one of the negotiators I was talking to at the COP was mentioning, that this is also very relevant, and they were saying, and this is an advisory opinion on the obligation of states in the context of climate change. So it'll be very interesting to see where that lands, where entry points might be found there. And again, it's about looking at this from all the perspectives, right? I mean, when we were talking about this, I was thinking, well, one thing that always comes up, right, is again talking about the fundamental principles and rights at work. One of them is forced labor. I mean, can we see some of these situations and see how this might actually be a situation of forced labor? So there are, I think there is space for flexible and creative thinking and looking at these categories and these different all these different things related to climate change through the lens of what we have already and seeing how it can apply in creative ways. So voilà, that's my last point on that. Thank you very much for the indulgence.
No, of course. Thank you, Paul. I think it was an important point about the ways that we can be creative in addressing this situation. So let me extend a very warm thank you to you, Paul, to Elizabeth, to Andrew for joining us today. I think it was a very enriching discussion that we were able to have. I see that Madhushika is asking to repeat the definition of resilience. It wasn't so much a definition that I was giving of the concept of resilience, but a bit an expansion of the point that, or let's try to reprise some of the points that Elizabeth was expressing about the fact that just because some coping mechanisms may be in place to be able to endure adverse situation, that doesn't mean that people are expected to endure adverse situation, but that perhaps the work should be addressed, yes, on building resilience, but also on addressing the root causes of why we need to be resilient in the first place. So that was a bit the point that we were trying to make, I think. Thank you very much once again to our speakers, and thank you to the participants for their contributions and their questions. I see that Marion has already kindly put in the chat the indications for the upcoming sessions next week. So we will see you very soon, and in the meantime, I'll take this opportunity to wish you also a very good continuation of the week and a very good weekend. More material is going to be updated on the eCampus soon, and we will see you next week. Thank you very much to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.